On to this evening's event. I'm delighted to welcome Aristide Chryssoulis from the University of Cambridge, who is just completing his PhD on life in the Principality of Samos, which is the subject of the talk. So, we're going to get it fresh from his research. His broader interests encompass diplomatic and consular history, the history of maritime and insular spaces, and environmental history. So he's currently teaching a course on early modern Mediterranean at the Faculty of History. And he's also involved in a postdoctoral project on forest management across the Greek islands in the 19th century. So something rather different, I think. So thank you for answering the door, but Aristide, welcome. The floor is yours.
And thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you. All right. Take use of mind. Yeah.
Where is it working?
Fine. Why always that thing? Just ignore her. Okay. All right. Okay. You can start. All right. You don't spread one. Fine. Okay. So hello everyone. Great pleasure to be here, and I'm glad to address my heartfelt thanks to the Levantine Heritage Foundation, its trustees, particularly Philip, Craig, and Quentin, as well as its members, for providing me with this forum to talk about some of the central themes of my research. And I should also like to acknowledge the presence here of friends, old and new, and to thank them for having accompanied me in and across this journey, but crucially for having braved today the combined challenge of terrible weather and tube strikes. So thank you very much. So to begin this talk, if I can bring up the PowerPoint mode.
Changing here, but it's not changing.
You click there as well. Okay. I'm on slide 2. You're on slide 1. So if you go click the PowerPoint, please.
What can the audience?
Yes, that's not happening. Do it at the beginning. So. Okay. Okay. And take a move. Can be fine. Okay. Amazing. All right. So to start, I'll start with the story. And instead of Samos as the background, it's set far away on the shores of the Black Sea in the Romanian port city of Sulina, right there, which should not be exactly in the sea, but on the coastline. In 1900, the ruling prince of Samos, Constantinos Vaianis, received a petition from a local professor of Greek and church cantor named Christodoulos. He had moved to Sulina 50 years prior, attracted by the prosperous lower Danubian trade, and had lived through its evolution from a minor cove under Russian and later Ottoman sovereignty to a thriving free port under Romanian rule. In this letter, sent to a prince far away, Harbis was pleading for help. One of his sons, Mikhail, had been forcibly conscripted into the Bulgarian army. This was illegal in his view, as his son was not Bulgarian nor indeed Romanian. Indeed, they were both Samnite citizens. So why then had this happened? The argument presented on the Bulgarian side was founded on its own law on subjecthood. Indeed, Mikhail had been born in the city of Silistra, right there, some kilometers south of Sulina, which in 1900 was Bulgarian territory. This made him a Bulgarian subject, and all male Bulgarian subjects owed a year of service in the armed forces. His father, however, argued for misunderstanding. When Mikhail had been born in the early 1870s, the autonomous Principality of Bulgaria did not yet exist, and Silistra was still directly administered by the Ottomans. And crucially, Mikhail being his son, Samnite laws on citizenship made him a legal holder of Samnite citizenship. He should thus not have been subject to foreign conscription. Beyond the conflict of citizenship and legal statuses, the story underscores a particularly thorny issue with 19th century legal forms of belonging. Indeed, as many researchers have shown, key amongst them being Jessica Martin, for example, these legal forms of belonging we nowadays call citizenship, nationality, were 2 centuries ago not yet standardized, as many of them were either still in the process of creation or of definition. And as I show in my research, this plasticity was even more evident in states which were self-governed and did not enjoy sovereign independence. This was both the case of Bulgaria and of the Principality of Samos, who shared the same nominal sovereign, the Ottoman Sultan. Samos, for example, paid a specific sum as tribute every year as a price for its autonomy. And crucially, thanks to this autonomy in government and legislation, both Bulgaria and Samos unilaterally created and defined the terms of the legal membership of their inhabitants. My doctoral research was very much about understanding how this worked in practice, specifically what local inhabitants and holders of such legal statuses understood of this, and where these statuses were situated on what clearly became a more complex and indeed non-linear history of citizenship and nationality. So, what happened in this case? And what are the takeaways? Firstly, we have here someone who knew his rights and crucially what they meant. He knew that being a Samiot citizen also meant being an Ottoman subject. The Principality of Samos, whatever its laws stated, as we will see, was an indivisible part of the Ottoman domains, and fealty to the Sultan was at the root of its condition. As such, before petitioning the prince, he had sought the help of Ottoman diplomatic authorities, notably the consulate in the city of Sulina, appealing them to assist, and I quote, one of its subjects, born in Ottoman territory. It was only after he failed to get help from the Ottomans that he wrote to the Samiot authorities. To them instead, he clearly stated that he had lawfully maintained the quality of the Samiot citizen despite decades away from the island, half a century. Long-term residents abroad risked losing their status if they did not actively keep it. Harbis therefore stressed that he and his family had remained lawfully registered with Samiot authorities, specifically the Samiot office in Istanbul, and that this office had issued them Samiot passports on several occasions. This time, however, his plea was answered, and Prisvayanis, who we saw in the picture ordered his administration to assist him. Whether the intervention secured Mikhail's release, I have not yet found archives uncovering the mystery. What I did find, however, was that 5 years later, in 1905, Mikhail Harbis, his siblings, and his mother had permanently left Sulina and resettled on Samos. His father, Chryssoulis, however, had by then passed away. This story in which an individual claimed specific rights under the tenure of Samiot citizenship was not uncommon. On the contrary, across many boxes and dossiers of the Principality's archives held almost in entirety on the island of Samos, it is not difficult at all to find traces of these cases. Today, we'll analyze several of these to show that for many Samiots, to hold Samiot citizenship functioned in their own understanding across the same set of expectations that one would hold from a state who would have held sovereign independence. Yet, the Principality of Samos was not such a polity. Let us say a few things first about its history, how this regime came to be, and what led it to the creation of Samiot citizenship. So, after centuries spent as a discrete province of the Byzantine Empire, the island of Samos became part of the Ottoman domains from the start of the 16th century. According to many conversion sources, Samos then was relatively void of its population, following several decades of constant maritime predation and raids from pirates and enemy fleets. As many other Aegean islands, it suffered the collateral damage of these regional wars and general insecurity. So to resettle it, the Ottomans brought in settlers, drawn mostly from Greek Orthodox surrounding insular and coastal populations, advantageous terms of religious freedom and collective self-governance, arrangements familiar across the recently conquered islands of the Aegean. This situation remained until the eve of the Greek rebellion, whose first part was lived far away on the other side of the Aegean, in the distant Peloponnese, in March 1821. The island, under pro-independence leaders such as Lycouros Logothetis and all the members of the decisive Philiketeria, or Society of Friends, joined the revolt in as early as April of the same year, 1821. Rejecting Ottoman rule and inspired by Enlightenment liberalism, they created the revolutionary regime known as the military political system of Samos. Its rulers were aligned with revolutionary Greece, whose territory it ultimately aimed to join. When Greece's independence was recognized by the Ottomans, however, Samos was kept out of its territory. Indeed, the island's fate was sealed far from it, as the great powers of France, Russia, Great Britain agreed with the Ottoman Empire that the status quo ante would not resume on the island. The Ottomans proclaimed that if the islanders accepted the Sultan's rule, a general pardon would be issued, and the island given a generous framework for self-rule. It would take 2 years, from 1832 to 1834, the exile of those who refused the new state of affairs, and Ottoman military intervention for the new regime known as the Principality of Samos to be enforced. This regime's framework was set by the organic regulation of 1832-1833, a Ferman or Sultanic decree issued then by Sultan Mahmud II. This text did not formally establish a Principality of Samos. It was rather a decree detailing the terms of an autonomous regime and appointing Stephanos Vogoridis, an Ottoman Greek aristocrat and statesman, as its ruler. The designation as a principality was essentially a mark of prestige, a rank to which the island had been elevated within the Ottoman imperial hierarchy and before European courts. In Ottoman terms, this was simply the beylik or emirate of Samos, of Sisam. In Greek, this was the Hegemonia Sisam. The Prince of Samos, known as Bey or Hegemon, was appointed by the Sultan from alternate Phanariot families, the Greek Orthodox elite of Istanbul. This was thus not a dynastic office, although it was concentrated amongst a relatively small circle of families, whose members accumulated Ottoman diplomatic positions throughout their careers. The Chryssoulis family was a notable example of this. Before serving as prince between 1866 and 1873, Pavlos Musuros had been ambassador to Austria. His brother Konstantinos is famous for being the first ambassador to Greece, before heading to Austria, the UK, and other European courts of note. His father-in-law was none other than the first prince, Stephanos Vogoridis. And finally, Pavlos's nephew, Stephanos Musuros, was ambassador to the Italian and British courts before serving as prince at the end of the 19th century. This is one particularly studied case, the Musuros family, as the family's archives survived and are of considerable wealth. But there were certainly other figures of note. The third prince, Ion, whose rule was one of the most appreciated in local historiographical work, later on became a figure of Romanian independence, becoming the country's first prime minister. Prince Constantinos Fotiades is also known for being an eminent intellectual who taught Ottoman literature at the Great National School in Constantinople. In Istanbul, was principal of the prestigious Galatasaray School as one of the translators of the Ottoman Civil Code, the Legele. Others had less successful ventures, and many considered that being prince of what was then a relatively unimportant island was not source of the greatest prestige. The Musuros family chief among them. Overall, beyond their prestige and influence among Ottoman circles of governance, the Phanariot filled the one consistent requirement to be a prince of Samos. So they had to be, in the words of the founding text, of the same religion and rites, the Samios, reflecting the island's overwhelmingly Greek Orthodox population. The princely regime falls into two broad periods. The first lasted from its creation until the revolt of 1849, 1850, which was in large part a consequence of the long and contentious reign of the first prince, Stephanos Vogoridis, who indeed never stepped foot on the island but ruled via governance. Years of tension between this absentee prince and Samiot notables, dissatisfied with the limited self-governance afforded to the island in practice, culminated in an open rebellion. This led to a revamping of the regime, as appears here, and the issuance of a second firman by Sultan Abdulmajid I, the Analytic Charter of 1850. Building on its predecessors, the charter clarified administrative, political, and judicial structures, and defined the respective roles of the Executive Council and the semi-legislative General Assembly. Yet, contrary to the insurgents' intentions, it maintained the prince's ultimate authority over both bodies. In civil terms, this was a constitutional, non-dynastic monarchy with limited oligarchic features and even more limited forms of representation. It was this imbalanced balance of power, so to say, that attracted for the most part the attention of historians of Samos as well as of the Phanagos. The latter often particularly treated the island as its odd seat of Phanaric power, but always seen from the point of view of the princes. My aim was thus instead to reverse the perspective and look at what Samos thought of this on a day-to-day basis, beyond the troubles stemmed from the recurring tension between the princely power and a not-prince. What I set out to do in my research was to ask different questions, ones rooted less in political thought than in legal knowledge and perception. What did islanders understand about the nature of this regime and its privileges? What did it mean to be referred to in legal texts as a Samoyed subject rather than an Ottoman subject? How did Samoyed citizenship come to exist, and what, if anything, made it distinct from Ottoman subject? In other words, what did it mean to be Samoyed in the 19th century? When Chryssoulis was made prince in 1832, the identity of the Principality's inhabitants received little formal definition. In both Greek and Turkish, they were generally referred to as the inhabitants, and of course, the inhabitants of the island of Samos, only occasionally as Samians. The island's territory was described as inseparable from the Sultan's domains, and the privileges granted were conditional on the inhabitants remaining loyal Ottoman subjects. Yet those same islanders held specific rights tied to the Principality. Key amongst those were, for example, that Samoyed vessels could fly the Principality's flag instead of the Ottoman, and that individuals carried passports issued exclusively by the island's authorities. Yet the founding text was silent on what criteria made someone a Samoyed. The only legal definition was a negative one. Samoyeds were exempt from needing permission to reside on the island and from the risk of expulsion. That applied to foreigners. This was a princely prerogative as devised in the first decree of 1832. The second one of 1850 still offered no formal definition, though it began introducing practical conditions that, in my view, acted as criteria for what could be considered as civic rights. In particular, political participation through election to the General Assembly was tied to property ownership, merchant or ship owner status, so-called patriotic loyalty, local taxation, and a clean personal record. Without ever defining citizenship directly, these conditions quietly created a distinction between Samoyed islanders from both other Ottoman subjects and foreigners. According to the early texts issued by Istanbul, being Samoyed was simply a matter of living on the island to enjoy whatever privileges it had been granted. This was not, after all, their purpose. The founding charters were designed to regulate governance and justice, not to establish a different form of belonging within the empire. So long as the island's inhabitants did not challenge Ottoman authority, Istanbul had in fact quite little interest in it. Regarding Samoyed passports, I was able to find a few of these in the archives, with the earliest surviving example dating from 1849. Issued by the Principality in the prince's name, they were standardized documents written in Greek and usually valid for 2 to 3 months, recording the bearer's physical description and destination, as you can see here. Their formula was consistent, summoning all those concerned to permit free passage to a Epikon Samian or Samoyed subject of a given profession, departing to a given destination, and to grant assistance and protection as needed from friendly authorities. These passports corresponded closely to Ottoman passports, as established in 1844, known as tezkere. They were in fact exactly the same, just those ones were in Greek, never in Ottoman. And they were issued for travel within the empire, with one key difference, said the language. Before then, the addition of French for those passports of longer duration, valid from 6 months to a year, and which allowed travel abroad specifically. In those, the standard text shifted accordingly. Foreign states were addressed as friends of the Ottoman government rather than of the Principality itself. the constitutional necessity, since Samos could not conduct official diplomatic relations as an equal sovereign. The task of defining who was Samos ultimately fell to the princely autonomous government. In 1860, Prince Miltiades Aristide declared that, considering there being no law regulating Samiot citizenship or naturalization procedures, and I quote, many unfortunate incidents had occurred in relation to the instance of princely passports, with numerous individuals lacking Samiot citizenship, nevertheless claiming princely protection. And later that year, the law Peri Samikis Ithagenias on Samiot citizenship was promulgated. The law, do you know which number did it say? Or no, it's okay. I'll find it. Anyway, the law clarified the conditions under which one could be or become a Samiot politis or citizen, as you can say here, polite. And the circumstances under which that status could be lost. His 13 articles combine ius sanguinis solely and an asymmetric ius matrimoni. In common parlance, this meant that birth on the island, Samiot parentage, or both, could establish right to citizenship, while foreign women marrying Samiot men acquired it automatically, though the reverse did not apply, hence the asymmetry. For undeclared Samiots, or foreigners, naturalization required 3 years residency, land ownership, and a clean criminal record, followed by the prince's approval, reflecting a moral and economic dimension to membership. For foreigners only, a further 3 years then had to pass before full civic rights could be exercised, after which applicants swore an oath of submission to the laws of the Principality and loyalty to the prince. The latter could also grant citizenship by merit to those who had made significant contributions to the island. Finally, citizenship could be lost by acquiring foreign nationality or by emigrating with no intention to return, commercial activity excepted. Reinstatement followed the standard procedure, with one exception: women who had lost Samiot citizenship upon marrying a foreigner could reclaim it upon widowhood. So what can we take away from this law? The most revealing observations concern, in a way, what is absent. There is no mention of religion, striking contrasts with the founding decrees, which emphasized the island's Christian homogeneity and required the prince himself to share the Samiot's faith. There was an even louder, so to say, absence. The Principality was under Ottoman sovereignty, yet the law makes no mention of the Ottoman Empire, its territory, or crucially the Sultan. To become a Samiot citizen, one needed to reside on the island or claim Samiot ancestry, and those who were naturalized would swear fealty to the prince, not to the Sultan. Furthermore, Samiot official parlance before the law commonly used ipikos, subject, or dotus, local, to refer to the islanders in all documents that I could find. After the law's adoption, which used Ithagenia, or which means indigeneity in its title, Samiots would be addressed as politis, or citizen. Yet, as we will see later, there was no Ottoman citizenship law at the time. In fact, no laws existed concurrently in the rest of the Ottoman Empire, which defined Ottoman subjecthood. Was this then what historians call a legal fiction, with Ottoman subjecthood simply left out, but meant implicitly? Or was it a deliberate omission, and if so, why? This question was, in many ways, the guiding thread of this research, and the answer, I suggest, lies somewhere in the middle, and is best found through what individuals made of it. At the heart of the law lies a genuine ambiguity. Because Samos was self-governing, it had the power to define its own members, yet there was no obvious reason to ignore the same Ottoman sovereignty that granted the autonomy in the first place, especially when it was the prince's role to be the guarantor of the island's fealty to the Sultan. So in my view, the reason for this ambiguity is to be found firstly in the independent judiciary and the specific influences on Samiot jurists and legislators. The Principality could draft and enact its own laws, one of its key privileges, and its legal system turned out to closely resemble that of contemporary Greece, as they both shared the same Roman Byzantine legal tradition. Indeed, Samiot lawyers were trained at the Faculty of Law in Athens, usually, and sometimes meditatorily. And as a result, Greek laws were sometimes adopted wholesale into Samiot legislation, with some revealing adaptations. And this was precisely the case here. The 1860 law, on the left, was a near exact copy of the Greek law, Peri Ellenitis Ithagenias on Greek citizenship, passed in 1835. A few differences from the Greek law are nonetheless worth noting. The Greek law itself did not define who were Greek citizens, but who Greeks were, a subtle but significant difference, as there is no mention of status anywhere in the law. It also drew explicitly on earlier revolutionary texts, which had defined Greeks as native Christian inhabitants of an undefined Greek territory, and extended that status to any foreigner who spoke Greek and professed Christianity. The Samnite law contained nothing of this kind. No reference to religion, no appeal to national identity, nor revolutionary heritage, even though it had a very strong one. Where the Greek law was a post-revolutionary instrument of nation building, the Samnite law instead was an instrument of administrative clarification. What further distinguished the Samnite framework was its permeability to Ottoman law. 9 years later, after the Samnite law was passed, the Ottoman government also promulgated the Tabiat Osmani Kanunanesi, sometimes translated either as the law on Ottoman nationality, as is in the contemporary translation in French, or on citizenship by later scholars, followed shortly by a directive, which I don't have here, explaining its provisions to all Ottoman and foreign authorities. Its effect on Samnite legislation was immediate. Prince Pavlos Moussorus promulgated a new Samnite citizenship law that was a near verbatim copy of the Ottoman statute. Where it crashed. This is the almost exact translation, just need to change Ottoman with Samnite, basically. But this new citizenship law was not too different from its 1860 predecessor, though its framing shifted from Greek, thus to Ottoman liberal tradition. Several differences between the two laws are nonetheless worth noting. Most strikingly, Ithagenis was, in this case, in the 1869, was henceforth preferred to politics, which brought back Samnite belonging to the level of subjecthood rather than of civic rights in the etymology. In practice, however, and as we saw in Harbis's letter 3 decades later, the term of citizenship of citizen prevailed. Another difference was that the new law tightened the conditions of naturalization. Those born on the island to foreign parents now faced a 3-year waiting period after adulthood before acceding to citizenship. A gradient was introduced within EU sanguinis. Children of original Samnite citizens could claim citizenship upon adulthood, while children of naturalized citizens faced the same 3-year residence requirement. Most consequently, the law introduced a contentious requirement of official permission from the prince for any Samnite wishing to acquire foreign nationality, mirroring the same provision in the Ottoman law, which had represented a significant tightening of control over those who sought to renounce their Samnite status while continuing to reside on the island. And I have a whole chapter of my thesis treating such contentious cases in which Samnites tried to escape or evade Samnite law by taking Greek citizenship. Indeed, for being Samnite gave access to both rights and duties towards princely authorities. So let's now see what it meant to belong to this somewhat peculiar quality. If the laws just discussed define who Samnite subjects or citizens were, the rights and duties attached to that status were no less carefully constructed, and in some respects preceded the first law of 1860. Several civic rights dated from the very beginning of the regime in 1832, such as personal freedom, the right to own property, and freedom of movement through the issuance of passports. Judicial rights were less clearly defined in the first decree, but the Princely Council's mandate over island administration implicitly included the delivery of justice to which all islanders had access. Between 1832 and 1850, all cases, civil, commercial, and criminal, could be heard before the executive, meaning the prince. This was part of this early concentration of executive and judicial authority in a single body, which became this central grievance behind the 1849 revolution. In its aftermath, the system was restructured. The 1850 decree laid the groundwork, and the princes Alexandros Kalimakis and Ion Gika, who we saw earlier, a reformed judiciary took shape in which judges, though still appointed by the prince, exercised independent judgment. The 1850 decree also reinforced the right to vote and to stand for election, for the Consultative General Assembly, which convened annually for approximately 1 month. The process was far from direct. All candidates required princely approval every 3 years, and mayoral elections followed a similar logic. Villages would elect 2 candidates, from whom the prince would select 1. Of course, there were of course categories of the islanders who could not vote, with women never given this right at any point by the regime, even if they did hold Samoyed citizenship. Other excluded categories included convicted criminals, tax defaulters, the clergy, princely officials, and specifically in the law, those suffering from leprosy. All other adult men could vote, provided they met one of the 2 conditions, paying at least 50 kurush in annual land taxes or owned a ship. This was a fairly low property threshold, a recognition that most islanders were either landowners or land-owning farmers. But it remained that this was far from a universal right. Standing for election imposed considerably steeper conditions. Candidates need to be older, literate, and able to demonstrate what was called in the law patriotism, or vatan perverlik, a criterion left undefined, but which could simply suggest a blind loyalty to the prince. Similarly, financial thresholds were much higher. In short, while voting was accessible to many adult male taxpayers, standing for election required education, property, and the confidence of the regime, which is why most scholars have characterized, as I said earlier, the Principality as a monarchy with oligarchic traits. These limitations notwithstanding, engagement with civic rights, as well as the request for protection and assistance wherever citizens were, even on the Black Sea, was ultimately the most visible and significant features of what it meant to be a Samoyed citizen. Indeed, in the 2nd chapter of my thesis, I highlight that Samoyed citizens' demands were synonymous to the expectations any contemporary citizen or subject would have of their own state. Yet Samos' prerogatives, despite the Principality's state-like endowment, were limited to the conditions of its autonomy. In other words, Samoyed citizenship looked like and was defined with the same terms of any other sovereign legal form of belonging. Yet it was no such thing, nor could such expectations be enforced by a state without full diplomatic strength. In other words, what I show throughout my thesis is this ambiguity between the appropriation of the sovereign model with the practical realities of autonomy. And one of those practical realities were taxation. As I mentioned earlier, because the Principality paid a tribute to the Sultan, an annual tribute, it exempted the islanders from direct Ottoman taxation. To collect the income to pay this tribute, but also to fund itself, the Principality exercised full control over its fiscal policies. The primary source of revenue throughout the regime was a tithe on agricultural goods, whose yield closely matched the annual tribute owed to the Ottoman government, as well as other income from customs and other temporary special taxes funding roads, docks, and education. There was also a direct levy on rental incomes remitted through the island's municipalities. Samoyeds being Christian subjects, one of the key taxes that they were exempt from was the head tax for non-Muslims, known until 1856 as the jizya, and after which known as the military substitution tax, which non-Muslims paid in lieu of military service. Samoyed citizens were thus a rare category amongst other Ottoman subjects, enjoying a special tax system. So rare that when they lived in the rest of the empire, Ottoman tax officials often disregarded these Samoyed exemptions. In the Principality's archives, there are countless petitions from Samoyeds living overseas and demanding or complaining about this undue taxation, to which the Principality often found itself unable to enforce due to its limited power beyond the island. Another crucial exemption which princely officials often had difficulty to enforce was the possibility for Samoyed islanders who worked as seasonal laborers in the Anatolian fields to return to Samos with the grain they had reaped, without any taxation on the weighted value. Both exemptions were a constant topic of dispute between princely and other Ottoman officials, and Samoyeds were often disillusioned with the ruling prince when they felt that he was not doing enough to enforce those exemptions. As I show in the 3rd chapter of my thesis, this duty of assistance beyond the island led to the Principality creating the Epistacea stewardship. Personally, I haven't found any trace of any photos or engraving of a steward, so I have a flag bearer of the Prince Gendarmerie. And Epistacea, or stewardship in loose translation, or bailiffs, but I prefer stewards. Yet in practice, these officials of the Principality settled across the main towns and several villages of Western Anatolia, basically the coastal region facing Samos, as well as in Istanbul, I mentioned the princely office earlier, carried duties which in all but name, and indeed diplomatic recognition, resemble that which consuls of foreign sovereign countries had in the Ottoman Empire. As such, countless cases in the archives, whether of petitions sent from Samos on the island or abroad, help draw the complex picture of Samiot perception, their status. In other words, what they themselves understood of this song. And this will be the subject of the last part of this talk. To undertake this, one of the sources I used was the Principality's archives on naturalization requests. Particularly noteworthy is the fact that I could not find any trace of such procedures before the law on citizenship. Whilst the language was administrative and thus repetitive, some cases shed light on the motives behind the requests. For example, in 1862, 22-year-old Themistoklis Iordaninis petitioned to transfer, and I quote, to Samiot protection from the English one, requesting recognition as a Samiot subject. So what did this mean here exactly? In his file, Iordaninis stated that he had inherited this English protection from his father, although it is not specifically stated. By comparing with other cases in the Samiot context, the most probable explanation was that his father had been a subject of the United States of the Ionian Islands, 7 Ionian Islands right there. And most of the Ionians in Samos were from Kefalonia, which I don't necessarily explain. And this polity was an autonomous protectorate of the British Empire. So when we see English protection here, this referred to the British imperial subjecthood, which provided imperial subjects with British consular protection when abroad. What further points to this is the context of the requests. Indeed, in 1862, London decided to cede this Ionian protectorate to the Kingdom of Greece, primarily to support the newly installed pro-British king, George III. As a result, Ionian subjects settled abroad could choose between either simply becoming Greek subjects under Greek consular protection, or indeed choose instead naturalization. And Samos offered this specific window. As I discussed in another chapter of my thesis, most Ionians living in Samos chose not to take Samiot citizenship, except for a friend here. From his file, we learn that he was a ship's captain, which it turns out was a rare profession amongst the Ionians settled in Samos, who for the most part were merchants. Perhaps commanding a Samiot flagged vessel was easier than Greek flagged, as he probably did not have the same resources or connections in the main Greek ports of Piraeus or Syros. And indeed, as set out by Samiot law, only Samiot citizens could flag the Principality's flag. Finally, his use of the terminology of belonging was instructive, as it related only to the notions of protection and subjection, rather than of belonging to a specific community or indeed nation. It remained that Samiot citizenship was created at a visible moment in which belonging to a community of civil and civic rights was taking over. The case of Emanuel Labropoulos, submitted just a few months later, illustrates this shift further. He was a Greek subject and sailor whose domicile was the Greek island port of Syros. In his file, he stated that he had resided, quote, in Samos until presently as a Greek subject, but now declared his wish to renounce his Greek ethnikotita, literally ethnicity, or perhaps more accurately, nationality, in order, and I quote, to reside in Samos as a Samiot subject and to rejoice in holding the rights of a Samiot citizen. Clearly for him, subjecthood, citizenship, and even nationality were synonymous, as whichever terms were used, his objective was the enjoyment of specific rights. Furthermore, being married to a Samiot woman and father to one child, his motives combined personal, familial, and professional considerations, most plausibly including employment on Samiot flagged vessels, a protected industry in which foreign sailors could not exceed half the crew. Greek subjects were not the only ones to seek Samic protection or citizenship. Ottoman subjects also navigated towards it. In 1863, for example, petitions were filed by an artist born in Cheshme, which is a small port village facing the island of Chios, then was small, let's say, and a captain from the Ottoman island of Patmos. The latter, a sailor named Marius Menachimos, is particularly instructive. Having resided on Samos for only 3 months, yet being married to a Samic woman, he grounded his petition explicitly in the relevant articles of the law, the requirement of official permission from the prince, and the declaration of municipal residence. That he cited specifically only these 2 articles, thus telling because he met neither the jus sanguinis nor the jus soli criteria, and marriage to a Samic woman, unlike the Riva situation, conferred no automatic right to citizenship. As a result, he was only allowed to change residence on the island, rather than gain access to full citizenship status. Overall, these individuals sought access to specific rights, which they considered as advantageous, particularly regarding taxation or for preferential treatment in their profession. Yet what is crucial is that none of these procedures made any reference to the Ottoman dimension of the status being sought. As a result, access to specific rights attached to Samic legal form of belonging constituted a valid alternative for individuals across the Aegean, alongside Greek and Ottoman subjecthood, as well as Ionian subjecthood for a short window of time, since one would need to formally renounce their previous status to acquire it. Ottoman subjects petitioning on the basis of residence and ancestry, treated the two statuses as broadly equivalent. What mattered ultimately were the civic rights attached to a particular place, and these were just a few examples across hundreds, with constantly increasing requests. While there were 380 recorded applications between 1816 and 1890, the double almost were sent until the end of the regime in 1912. One could argue, however, that compared to a population of around 50,000 at the turn of the century, some 20 applications per year, not many at all, with a ratio of approximately 1 in every 2,500 Samic citizens being naturalized. Samic perception of their status spanned, in fact, many other archival series, which I consulted, with hundreds of petitions from natural-born Samic citizens demanding assistance or acting on their rights. So while many of the naturalization petitions demonstrated precise knowledge of what citizenship could confer, the full spectrum of perception also contained those individuals who either tried to escape princely control over their mobility, or indeed those who either took their status for granted or remained largely indifferent to it. I should thus like to end this talk with a case of indifference to the top-down creation of a status by the island's elite. One such group were the herdsmen of Samos, to whom the princely authorities were simply another administrative layer of the Ottoman Aegean Islands. These herdsmen practiced insular transhumance. Livestock were moved between islands and islets in search of fresh pasture, and sometimes disputes over animals would arise. One such case from 1895 was brought to the princely authorities by the Pat groups. So right here, herdsman named Marcos Kodoyanis. The affair had started after 4 individuals had allegedly stolen 34 sheep and goats from him on the small islet of Amidros. I have to take Google Maps for this one. So this is Patmos, and Amidros is right here. They had allegedly fled westwards towards Amoros in Greece, or Naxos, but this was the direction. The princely authorities were drawn in when Samos right there, when 2 of the suspected thieves were possibly spotted on south of Samos, on Panucula here. Small islets south of Samos under the princely jurisdiction. The Patniot believed that a herder named Manuel Milianos, living there, was what he called a receiver of stolen goods, and requested that the Principality open an inquiry which it did. So the prince agreed, and a Samiot magistrate was sent there to investigate. And in the interrogation records, the herdsman described himself in the following manner. Born on Patmos, he was an Orthodox Christian and had resided on Samiopoula for the past 10 years with his family, within princely jurisdiction. Whilst he clearly could be eligible to Samiot citizenship, he did not either mention being an Ottoman subject or any sort of subject. His herd numbered around 120 sheep and goats, which he had transported earlier that year by sailing boat to the uninhabited islands of Kalovolos and Makronici in the archipelago. A few nautical miles east of Patmos in search of fresh pasture. Milianos denied that anyone had brought additional animals to his islet, noting only the occasional passage of sailing boats. When asked who could vouch that the herd was his, Milianos replied that all the residents of Spatare and Pagoda, these were towns of southern Samos, knew he had come many years ago with many animals and had been selling lambs and goats to them ever since, adding that his herd bore distinctive marks from his previous sellers. His answers also revealed an intimate knowledge of the regional ecology and geography. Though he had never set foot on Amiros, he knew it well by reputation, comparing it to the islets he would usually take his flock to. Ultimately, he denied any involvement in the theft, and his son Yorgos, interrogated separately, gave identical answers, to the disappointment of the patent, who had to accept that his herd had simply been taken and probably sold abroad. This case underlines how an Ottoman subject could settle within a self-ruled Ottoman province without care for its status, conduct trade across the region, and be accommodated by local economies and authorities with little friction. As such, he operated independently of the legal categories created by the Principality, even if he had resided in it for the past 10 years. When asked to identify himself, Milianos stated his origins and his faith, underlining what ultimately mattered to him. Even more surprisingly, no magistrate raised the question of passports or identification papers. Instead, his identity was confirmed through his reputation within the Transaegean herding community. What this case ultimately illustrates is that Samiot citizenship was not a claim of identity, but a status that conferred specific civic rights, rights that mattered in some contexts and not in others. Whether through passports, naturalization petitions, or the deliberate avoidance of official structures, Samiots and foreigners alike recognized when asserting their legal status was useful and when it was not. For some, it opened professional commercial pathways, for others, it offered protection or integration, and for others, still like Milianos, it was simply beside the point. The existence of Samiot citizenship demonstrates that in the 19th century, marked by increasing demands for civil and civic rights across Europe, and indeed in the Ottoman Empire, especially from the late 1840s, a small autonomous polity would articulate access to its own civic rights through eerily similar models. Drawing first on the Greek law, before realigning with Ottoman law, it never, however, imported the national or religious criteria that characterized other similar autonomous polities. Before their independence, for example, both Serbia and Romania, on top of Greece, restricted naturalization to Christians. Yet the Principality of Samos, being the collateral outcome of the Greek national movement, rather than a political project in its own right, did not go beyond its mandate. What resulted, to conclude, was a relatively unique hybrid legal form of belonging, which used the language of sovereign models, yet adapted them to the island conditions. To be Samiot thus meant to exist as a unilaterally created subcategory of Ottoman subjecthood, without Ottoman consent, yet through which they had to abide by. Without Samiot consent, through which they had to abide by. Indeed, in practice, for most individuals, this plasticity of belonging was not relevant or indeed particularly interesting on a day-to-day basis. What mattered rather more was enforcement of the rights they were promised, both inland and overseas. Because of this, in other chapters of my thesis, I show how this realm of expectations led the Principality to act as if it were more than a territorially restricted autonomous polity, and began projecting its authority and even its law overseas to unequally successful results. Nor would it ever step closer to the mark of sovereignty. And on that, thank you very much.
Excellent, Aristide, thank you very much. So if we have questions online or in the audience, do let me know, wave a hand. We have one here. If you're online, do turn your video on, raise a Zoom hand, catch my attention some way. But first we'll take one from the floor here.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I actually didn't know too much about it, so it was interesting to hear. My question was more about why did the Ottoman Empire allow this to happen? Because I'm curious to know if the islands around Samos had the same particularity around the citizenship as they had, and if they didn't, why would they allow this? Because ultimately, they're not making the taxes from it, they're not getting all the benefits from it, they don't have their armies that I assume are residing there. So why would they allow this to happen, considering it's quite further away from Greece mainland, where most of the revolution happened at that time?
I mean, that's kind of the main question in a way. There's different answers. The first one, which is the easy one, is that they didn't really care. And indeed, they didn't really recognize in any. So quite frequently, they would send new decrees to Samos whenever they requested new rights and so forth. But they would never speak about a Samian citizen or use the same term. So the terminology was a bit dissonant in a way. The Greeks were saying something and the Ottoman Turkish was saying something different. So that's one answer. They didn't really care. They didn't really care because there was an annual tribute coming in for the Ottoman treasury every year. As long as they paid it, it was fine. And where they is something which I'd be curious to see a bit more. And I've done some research in Ottoman history that I've looked at in the correspondence, maybe some petitions sent from the Samites and so forth, is to see what terms the Samites used when they were speaking to the Ottomans. So the first case I opened with was Samite subject. They would refer themselves as Ottoman subject, so that's one example. But there's much more I need to check in that context. As to the other islands, Samite was unique in that sense. It was basically the only case for most of the 19th century in the Aegean to have like a state-like endowed autonomous structure. There were other examples, Crete, but that was very short-lived, and the Ionian case, which was a British protectorate. But Samos was its own case. The other islands, so the remaining Ottoman directly administered Ottoman islands, let's say Lesbos, Rhodes, and so forth, Chios, they, depending on their population, these, for example, those islands had slightly more Muslim population. Okay. There was more local Ottoman presence, and the Ottoman Christian population there enjoyed some form of autonomy, but nothing like the Samite case. So that's one of the answers. But basically, I'm interested in researching that Ottoman part more in the archives, because most of my research was in the Samite archives.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks.
Yes, Samos.
Thank you. This was very interesting. I'm baffled by the titles. Why on earth would they use the term prince or principality? I understand the Yemon, which has no aristocratic connotations in the Greek language to an extent. They, entirely different story, but in English, princes, this certainly in English or even in French carries an aristocratic connotation, which from your talk we understand wasn't there in any shape or form, even that it was an annual or biannual office. So why princes?
So it was their choice because it's procedure to be prince. So it was the prince's choice, the Phanariots, to call themselves prince in diplomatic language, which was French. So in this case, they would often assign us prince or principality to some of them. When they speak in English, it's principality. But in Greek documentation, they chose hegemonia, which is a reference also to Moldavia and so forth, and also in the Byzantine case.
Is that self-aggrandizement then? Is that self-aggrandizement? Like Mavrocordatos would like people to refer to him as prince, although he wasn't any of the sorts.
Because if there was a bit of a dissonance between an island, which didn't really matter that much economically, there wasn't huge trade coming out of it, but yet they were given as Phanariots this island to govern. So to be a prince was, but sometimes they would even fight to be called prince, or even to get the title of bey. Hegemons, they would always give themselves that title, but the sultan would always take some time to actually grant them the recognition of they were the bey of Samos. Sometimes they were just the governor, and then they would become the bey, which bey means governor to a certain extent, depending on the period.
And sorry, last question. Do you have any evidence in French or English where people from abroad and maybe nobles themselves would actually say, well, how do you call yourselves? This, you're not that, or don't recognize your princes?
So they did, in a way, they very much did recognize there was a principality, because you would have consulates on Samos, even though didn't really. Often there was this funny little situation where there would not be a lot of foreign merchants on Samos, and often those foreign merchants would become consuls themselves, self-appointed consuls, and they would claim that they were consuls and not vice consuls, for example, because they were a consulate to a principality and not to a random town in wherever in the Ottoman Empire. So for them it actually mattered very much, and of course it would. Thank you.
How did you become Prince of Samos? Who chose the Prince of Samos?
So the Sultan.
The Sultan.
The Sultan from a pool of candidates.
And presumably they paid for the office.
One would assume so. One would assume
There's
so.
no record of that. Or
Well, that would be surprising if they had records of that.
did the families probably have agreements among themselves who would be the next one?
This I don't know for sure. The main family of the dynasty, let's say, prince, which has been studied, was the Musoros family. Yes. Musoros, Govaridis, and all that dynasty, because their archives as well were very well preserved. And there's a whole book by whose name I forget, but Olivier Bouquet, and another Turkish Ottomanist, who worked on those archives and mainly correspondence between different Musoros members of the family. And one of the then Prince of Samos complained that he was a prince there because he'd rather be in Paris or in London rather than be in Samos, for example.
And was there a real parliamentary life? Was there a parliament?
There was.
With debates?
Mm-hmm.
Freedom of debate?
Well, freedom, but it was consultative, so it wasn't particularly respected. I mean, there's a whole part of this story which is a long story of social strife on the island, and there are different historiographies, which from one side, usually the Greek side, would look at the social strife in the idea that, well, in any case, Samos became Greek at some point, so that was the ultimate objective in any case. It was just the Principality as maybe a delayed era of history, and more Turkish Ottoman side, which didn't care that much about that aspect. But there were the direct connection between, let's say, there was the revolt in 1850 and the creation of Samos citizenship. For me, it's difficult to find exactly in the archives. It's conjecture, it's a context. But in a way, this law here and those civic rights and so forth were created mainly because people would take some passports and enjoy those rights without through fraud, basically. So it was an issue of fraud.
One last question. It's such a fascinating alternative to nationalism, sort of islandism. Do you find evidence of other islands wanting a similar status, or in 1912 and again in 1862 in the Ionian Islands, some people who wanted to remain under a sovereign island and not join Greece or Turkey? Or
so not exactly. So in the Ionian case, to be fair, and I did look this from afar through secondary sources, the Ionians were not really given any choice. So the British gave away the islands to Greece, and that's it. And indeed, in terms of autonomy, it was an autonomy for a governor of the island to do what they wanted. But in fact, the Union subjects didn't really have any political say, in fact, for most of those affairs. So that's one case. In Crete is a very different story in the sense that there were constant revolts in Greece, ultimately to join Crete to join Greece, and there was a short period of autonomy, which was interesting because this was the Cretan state who had the prince as a head of state, who was the prince of Greece. There was a very different kind of alleyway. And at the end of the period, so in 1912, when Samos and all of the other Eastern Ottoman islands become part of Greece, not because of something that they did, but because of the Balkanic Wars, there was a project on Samos of some form, not necessarily of independence, but increased, plus, let's say, independence, where a prince, basically it was very similar to what the Cretans had. So the prince would be a British prince or a Greek prince or a French prince, but not an Ottoman prince. That was one issue. But still recognizing Ottoman sovereignty over it. So ultimately, the Samites never really tried to become independent as such. The point was to join Greece ultimately, but there was a constant recognition through the period in a day-to-day way of the advantages that they had. And a lot of individuals in the area and economic in the region, so forth, saw the advantage of that, of having Samian subjecthood, sometimes combining both. So cases of dual citizenship, which I've seen in other, which I look at in other chapters. So this led to interesting disputes, conflicts of citizenship in a way in this context. So it's a very small window to very bigger problems, which were much bigger than some of themselves, but itself. But in the end, what matters is to look at what people understood of this.
What matters is
what people understood of this,
Yeah.
ultimately. Anyway, but
thank you.
Let me just check. Is there anyone with a question online?
some in the chat.
Anything in the chat? Okay, no.
That's my question.
Maybe I can ask a question. It seems that over a period there was a stable relationship between Samos and the Sublime Porte. Were there any occasions, incidents where Constantinople intervened? And was there ever a garrison on the island?
So that was a big thing. One of the main privileges of the Principality was that there would be no Ottoman garrison on the island. But very quickly there was an Ottoman garrison on the island from basically the point that they rebelled in 1850. Then there was a very small Ottoman garrison, and I found basically across the period, and this is something where Ottoman archives would really help me, although I'm not sure if I would ever find something. I would, for example, interested in the numbers of soldiers that would be settled there. From what the Samian archive showed me, there was no more than 10 people, 10 or 15 soldiers that would just sit in one house, basically, up until the next rebellion in 1908. Then they sent a lot of people, and that was after a prince was murdered. But otherwise, apart from 1850 and that rebellion in 1908, there weren't constant cases of rebellion. It was more of a day-to-day, like usually complaining maybe of the status, of the limitedness of the Principality and enforcing those rights and so forth. But on the island itself, whatever happened there, the princes, the government, and the elite usually had a wide say. So the Ottoman garrison, I don't have the photo, but basically when Samos joined Greece in 1912, there's this photo actually of the Ottoman garrison departing by boat. But throughout the regime, there was a big presence.
And is there any evidence of communication between the prince and the sultan on day-to-day routine reports or extraordinary reports?
I'm sure there is. There's certainly letters addressed to the Sultan, but which the Sultan would never necessarily open. Lots of letters received from the Sultan, but from the court ultimately. I would assume more from the prince's side, demanding aspects rather than from the Sultan, who ultimately didn't really care.
Yeah, so it was an economic judgment. The island doesn't matter. We don't need to worry about it.
But very much so.
As long
And the
as they
big problem
pay,
was,
it's okay.
and whenever the tribute was a bit late, but ultimately it's kind of understanding what the whole thing was.
I have a question as well. So it seems that it was attractive to be from Samos or citizen of Samos, but the naturalization rate was not that high. Do you have any cases of, like, do you know how many were rejected, for example, or
So,
how many applications were made?
So that's something, the quantitative aspect, I don't have this, that's the main aspect I have. However, what I showed is the total of applications sent. I went through most of them, and most of them were accepted, because it was quite easy to see when they were accepted. But that's why I didn't actually, if I saw that it was mostly half there with the system and see if there was something interesting there. And what interested more was qualitatively, in the sense of what was being said and what was being asked and the reasons and so forth. But ultimately, no, it's not a lot of people. I compare to, but that's a very odd and bizarre data, but just to give a frame of idea, I compare to the rent of new British citizens to naturalized citizens today to the population, right? Like 1 to 200 and 250, yeah, 150. Whereas here, times 10, basically.
So 1 to 2,050.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's much smaller in Samos by far.
Any reason for that? Was it that it wasn't that well known that you could be naturalized?
So that's one aspect. You would kind of need to reside there, have some connections there, have some business connections there. But ultimately, so I Samo at some point where it's 20 per year or something. There were some cases where that was true, but then there were some very specific cases, specific years where it was 200 people demanding to be, and this was usually when there was war between Greece and the Ottoman Empire. And so obviously that's one aspect of the story. It's the official demands for naturalization. The big problem that the Principality has is with contraband through the use of its own flag. Obviously, they would not be asking the contrabands to have an actual Samian passport and so forth, but they would use the flag and so forth. So there's a big part of it, usually around conflicts in the Aegean, of the Samian flag being used to avoid control and so forth. So it was interesting, but naturalization requests are one useful way of understanding why some people just want to be Samians, where when it wasn't really obvious in the archives, obviously, because it's the silence in the archives. Yeah? The fraud reports on that show the other side of the picture.
Yeah, I've got another question. From a constitutional perspective, when they went about devising this new policy.
Θέλω να με βοηθήσεις σε κάτι.
Λοιπόν, τι θέλεις?
I'm just following a talk. According to my laptop, this talk is being recorded. And
Yes.
I would like to find out where can I find the recording material.
Good question.
Αμέσως.
No, it's not urgent, but
It depends on the speaker. If the speaker gives permission,
you
we'll be on
managed
the
to find out where exactly. It says, I don't know, it says it's recorded in the cloud. How can I get into the cloud to find out whether it is recording there?
It will be available soon.
Experiencing now, your head will become a roundabout, so it's better I'm late.
All right. Whenever you are free, okay?
Yeah, no problem.
Anyhow, moving on from that, what were the influences constitutionally? Whose system in other words were they copying? Was it a British system? Was it a Venetian system? Was it a mix of the above with the French system? How did they devise this constitutional arrangement?
The
Principality, yes.
So for the citizenship law or as a principality?
How they govern the place? You mentioned the Senate or the Parliament.
Yeah.
The offices, etc.
That's a very interesting question, actually. Because for the laws and so forth, the models were Greek and through Greek French, Napoleonic civil code. Most of the laws were mixed of that with Roman Byzantine law. As for the constitution itself and the function, so the first Prince Vavorides had a great saying with that, and he mostly copied it from what was going on in Moldavia and Wallachia. But then this changed after 1850. And there the influence is a very good question.
Because to me it all sounds Venetian.
Okay.
Instinctively, that's what I thought when you were describing it. And I wonder whether, because again, maritime nations, naval empire, commerce, merchants, whether there was any relationship with Venice. And
very interesting.
I mean, maybe with the first prince, was he the one that actually shaped the constitution?
He shaped it, but then after 15 years it changed. So
yeah.
But I'll come back to that. Thank you.
Another question. I was intrigued. How come Agika went off to Romania?
That's
the connection.
I think he was Romanian, or
maybe, but yeah, to go on to be prime minister.
Family who had land in Romania, because they'd been princes on and off of Wallachia, Moldavia since the 17th century. So they're living between Istanbul, Romania, and did he go to Samos?
Agika. Yeah, he was prince before being Romanian prime minister.
And then such multiplicity of nationalities was more normal than we think, I think.
Yes. Another question for me. Did Samos have a foreign policy?
Well, they had a foreign ministry. Yeah. Wow. So that's interesting.
And consuls abroad?
But they had the status. So but none of these had the, let's say, the value of the quality, let's say, of sovereignty. But in all aspects, they acted as an actual state. They could simply not, in terms of foreign policy, they could not sign treaties and so forth.
Interesting. Any last questions? Anything from the audience online? No? Okay, let's wrap it up there. Aristide, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Fascinating talk. Yeah, never heard. And we'll say goodbye to everyone online. Thank you for joining us. And for those here in London, we have a glass of wine if you'd like to stay on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.